Eleanor of Castile's marriage to Edward I was a historical anomaly. They were happy, faithful, and fruitful. But if Eleanor knew about what Edward did to their son after she died, it would have horrified her beyond belief. Though she would go on to rule England by her royal husband's side, Eleanor's life actually began in Spain. She was born in Burgos to her father, King Ferdinand of Castile, and mother, Queen Joan, Countess of Ponthieu. Her path to British royalty would begin with some early tragedy. Eleanor of Castile was the second of 5 royal children. All 4 of her siblings were boys. Tragically, however, only 3 of the boys survived. Louis, who was born a year or 2 after Eleanor, perished in childhood. Their parents ensured that the remaining royal Castilian children would have every advantage. From an early age, Eleanor of Castile and her siblings received a courtly education. This, of course, included lessons on etiquette, politics, and the expectations placed on young princes and princesses. But notably, there was a strong focus on deeper subjects too. This set Eleanor up for even more success. King Ferdinand's court was especially notable for its literary atmosphere. The royal children, at their parents' behest, acquired an extensive aptitude and appreciation for reading and writing, meaning it was likely that the standard of Eleanor's education was high even for royalty. Her gratitude to her father showed in special ways. Not long after the passing of Eleanor's brother, tragedy would strike the royal family once again. In 1252, when Eleanor was around 11 or 12 years old, the king met his demise in Seville after contracting dropsy. Ever the devoted daughter, Eleanor was present at her father's deathbed to see him into the next life. She now faced her duty of carrying on the family bloodline. The king's successor was Eleanor's half-brother, Alfonso X, who quickly got to work arranging a politically beneficial marriage for the young princess. In an attempt to wrest control of the kingdom of Navarre, Alfonso proposed a marriage between Eleanor and the boy king Theobald II of Navarre. Sensing the Castilians' desire for control, however, Theobald's mother and regent Margaret of Bourbon nixed the idea entirely. Around the same time, Alfonso became engaged in a dispute over lands in Gascony with King Henry III of England. In a negotiated settlement, Alfonso agreed to wed Eleanor to the king's son, Edward I. The couple wed on November 1, 1254, when Eleanor was just 13 years old. Edward and Eleanor of Castile already had some family connections. His grandfather had been King John of England, and her great-grandmother was Eleanor of England. Both were the children of King Henry II, making the newlyweds second cousins once removed. As part of the marriage agreement, Edward now controlled the disputed lands in Gascony and adopted the title Lord of Aquitaine. Eleanor accompanied her new husband to his new seat of power, where they stayed for a year. Things escalated quickly. Tragedy befell the young couple early on. While in Gascony and at only 13 and a half years old, Eleanor of Castile gave birth to a daughter. Devastatingly, however, the infant girl did not survive long. Perhaps it was this unbearable event that made Eleanor decide to move to England alone in 1255. Her husband would follow a few months later, but things didn't get much easier. With her marriage to Edward, Eleanor helped to resolve the Gascon crisis. However, there were still tensions among the two royal families, and Eleanor's presence at court only compounded the atmosphere. King Henry's closest allies and advisors were likely troubled by the presence of this young Castilian now inside the gates. The prince, however, could not have felt more different. Eleanor of Castile and her husband Edward evidently had a very close and intimate marriage, displaying deep love and devotion to one another. Edward was reportedly faithful to her, never taking any mistresses, a rarity for a royal. The couple were scarcely apart for long. They even had their own cute rituals. Royal family records have described Edward and Eleanor's relationship as comfortable, humorous, and playful. Every Easter Monday, for example, Eleanor would have her ladies trap Edward in his bed so that he would have to pay them a ransom and go to her bedroom after Lent had ended. Eleanor showed her love and familiarity in other adorable ways too. Edward was quite an introverted man and resented having to attend ceremonies as part of his duty. When invited to the wedding of the 5th Earl of Norfolk, Edward at first refused to go. Eventually convincing him to attend, Eleanor hired minstrels specifically to entertain her husband while he sat alone at the wedding as a gesture of love. Edward and Eleanor were practically joined at the hip, and they took their devotion to each other to the next level. She even accompanied her husband when he went to war. During a military campaign in Wales that Edward featured in, Eleanor stayed in Carnarvon Castle near the front lines. She took on a role beyond simple moral support. Edward's father Henry became embroiled in a war with his barons in the 1260s, known as the Second Barons' War. Eleanor actively supported her husband's interests in this war, going so far as to import archers from Castilian allies in France. she took a hands-on approach in other wartime necessities. Eleanor of Castile assisted in holding Windsor Castle for her husband during the conflict, keeping a watchful eye on the baronial prisoners held in the castle dungeons. As rumors built that she was seeking to enlist more troops from Castile to the cause, things took a turn for the worse. After the royalist army suffered defeat at the Battle of Lewes, the barons captured Edward and took control of Windsor Castle. And they didn't stop there. Baronial leader Simon de Montfort ordered Eleanor's removal from the castle, and they confined her to Westminster Palace under the supervision of the baronial army. But just when it looked like all was lost, the royals' fortunes turned around. At the subsequent and pivotal Battle of Evesham in 1265, the royalist army won a decisive victory and resecured their power over the land. The barons had lost. The government needed serious reform after this, and Edward took a major role in these efforts. Eleanor of Castile would rise to prominence alongside her beloved. Eleanor's family in Castile were heavily involved in the Crusades, which were ongoing at the time. The princess's commitment to the church's campaign was just as steadfast as her kin. She vowed support and participation, convincing her husband to do the same. It would offer them some interesting working holiday opportunities. England was at peace in 1270, and Eleanor of Castile and Edward took this opportunity to join the Eighth Crusade of King Louis IX of France, Edward's uncle. But things didn't go quite as planned. Louis perished at Carthage before the couple could link up with him. Instead, they proceeded to Sicily to winter there, before arriving in Acre in the Holy Land in 1271. While there, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter who, due to her birthplace, became known as the Joan of Acre. But drama seemed to follow the pair everywhere. The ruling dynasty of Acre was concerned with the presence of British royalty on their land, and in June 1272, an attempt was made on Edward's life. Stabbed in the arm by a poisoned dagger, he entered an intense period of sickness and suffering, resulting in the removal by a surgeon of the diseased flesh of his arm. Eleanor was inconsolable, allegedly weeping and wailing by her beloved's bedside, but other accounts told a different story. More on that later. Either way, Edward would survive and the couple would soon go on to rule. King Henry III perished on November 16, 1272. Following this news and the prince's recovery, Edward and Eleanor returned to England. On August 19, 1274, Edward was crowned King of England, and Eleanor his queen consort. It was not her only title. Eleanor's mother Joan also passed away a few short years after her daughter's ascension to the throne. With this, Eleanor now attained the title of Countess of Ponthieu. It is unknown if she ever spent much time in Ponthieu, but she did send her daughter Joan to foster there, a common practice among nobles of the time. Eleanor was unfortunately no stranger to losing children. Throughout history, it's been important for a king's wife to provide an heir, and Eleanor took that responsibility seriously, to a nearly unbelievable degree. Eleanor likely mothered somewhere between 14 and 17 children with Edward over her lifetime. Most were born at Windsor, though 3 were born while Eleanor was traveling. Tragically, however, only a total of 6 of the couple's children survived into adulthood, a devastating statistic. Perhaps this was the cause of Eleanor's cold parental style. Eleanor's inattentive parenting style sometimes resulted in heartbreaking circumstances for her offspring. In 1274, the royal couple's 6-year-old son, Henry, was terminally ill in Guildford, where his grandmother was raising him. Despite the prognosis that young Henry would not survive, neither of his parents made the short journey from London to be with their ailing son. Eleanor apparently had more important things to worry about. Eleanor gained notoriety for her vast land acquisitions, a practice for which she received much criticism. Between 1274 and 1290, the Queen Consort acquired an array of estates from middling landed classes that brought in about £2,600 annually, an unthinkably large amount of money for the time. There was something of a political reason for this. The Queen Consort's lavish lifestyle amounted to an annual expenditure of £8,000, and Edward did not want government funds to go towards his wife's expensive habits. Furthermore, he wanted to ensure her financial independence in the event of his premature passing, but the ethics of all of this were questionable. At the time in England, there was a rising wave of anti-Semitism, with the Jewish community taxed far beyond its means in an effort to drive them from the country. Eleanor used this to her advantage, buying up properties from Jewish landowners who now found themselves in unmanageable debt. Her endeavors made her unique among English queens. Though Eleanor's means of attaining her wealth were problematic, she was nonetheless a pioneer in the institutional standing of English queens. Her financial independence was a first for her position, and the independence of action enjoyed by future queen consorts of England is thanks to Eleanor. Her trailblazing was not exactly embraced at the time. Eleanor's unrestrained acquisition of land through usury and dispossession prompted wide condemnation from her contemporaries. She received criticism from all strata of high society, from members of the landed classes to the church, and even had unfavorable poems written about her by notable scribes. There were terrible knock-on effects too. Eleanor's exploitation of Jewish debtors only contributed to the rising anti-Semitism in the country, and things came to a disturbing conclusion. These rising tensions culminated in the 1290 Edict of Expulsion, which lawfully expelled the entire Jewish population from England. Eleanor benefited indirectly from this too. The houses, debts, and other property left behind by the exiled Jews were forfeit to the crown, but the oppression didn't stop there. Even before the expulsion, Eleanor was already enriching herself off Jewish misery. In the late 1270s, many Jews were targeted for the offense of coin clipping. The accusations were almost completely false, but nonetheless, over 300 individuals received hanging sentences. Eleanor received a significant portion of their seized assets too. Then she added insult to injury. Following the expulsion of the Jews, Eleanor found herself in possession of more property than she knew what to do with, including a number of now abandoned synagogues. One in particular, located in Canterbury, she decided to impart as a gift. She ended up giving it to her tailor. With that out of the way, family matters took priority. Though her parenting style was distant towards her younger children, Eleanor seemed to become more involved in their lives when they got older and were able to travel with them. She seemed to want to keep them close, and even convinced her husband not to marry the daughter, also named Eleanor, to a foreign ruler in 1282. Despite the political benefits this would have brought, this was indicative of her role at court. Though Eleanor was never given an overtly political role at court, she nonetheless held some sway over her husband's decision-making. She received training in diplomatic matters pertaining to welcoming visiting foreign dignitaries, but she never took part in settling disputes, other than minor ones between England and her native Gascony. Nonetheless, she courted controversy. There were some occasions when Edward felt he had to rein his wife in, showing the limits of Eleanor's influence. One such occasion was when the Queen was demanding the Bishop of Winchester repay a debt he owed her. Due to the importance of maintaining close ties with the Church, Edward's Lord Chancellor settled the matter in the bishop's favor. Not everyone bristled at Eleanor's character, however. Records seem to indicate that Eleanor treated people very differently depending on how she saw them. She appears to have been very considerate, kind, and loyal to her inner circle of friends and family. However, other reports were far more damning. To those outside her immediate circle, she was harsh and manipulative. There are also reports that she had a very short temper. Emotional regulation may not have been her thing, but she had other skills. Eleanor seemed to have a very practical nature. While most royals had a reputation for their lavish and constantly changing wardrobes, Eleanor appeared to prefer casual everyday dress. Furthermore, she reportedly liked to repair clothes rather than replace them when they became damaged, another unorthodox trait for a woman of her social standing. Her influence reverberated in the culture. Eleanor of Castile had great cultural influence over England at the time. She herself had a broad range of interests, including hunting, chess, horse riding, and breeding. But there was one interest nurtured in childhood that lasted her whole life. Eleanor was a prolific patron of literature, and she had a wide-ranging and sophisticated interest in many different varieties of writing and story. She had her own dedicated scribes and illuminators to copy books for her, and even had some books commissioned. Their language might surprise you. Eleanor of Castile spoke French, the language of her mother, and all her books were in this language. One could be forgiven for thinking she would have struggled with this in England, but at the time, French was actually the dominant language of the English court. Eleanor's skills did not stop at the written word. Eleanor's domestic duties included decorating the royal residencies, and she showed quite an aptitude for this task. She emphasized comfort in her designs and commissioned tiled bathrooms in the style of her native Castilian culture. Her influence began to spread. Eleanor would also hang tapestries and carpets on the walls of her residences, a practice initially seen as a Spanish extravagance. However, rich and royal elites increasingly adopted the style. By the time of Eleanor's passing, it was ubiquitous and in vogue. Her influence was evident outdoors too. Tales of Eleanor and Edward's passion for each other have stood the test of time, making them one of history's greatest love stories. And some stories, though perhaps apocryphal, shows just how devoted they were. In one account of Edward's attempted assassination in Acre, it's claimed that Eleanor was the one to suck the poison out of his wound after he was stabbed with a dagger that had been dipped in poison. On the evening of November 28, 1290, Eleanor of Castile passed on at the age of 49. Not much remains about the exact cause of her demise, but medical records suggest she may have contracted malaria and succumbed to it due to related complications. Her passing received a mixed response. Posthumous accounts of Eleanor have varied. Many of them, including fictions inspired by the real-life woman, have portrayed a wide-ranging opinion of the queen. Some painted her as a kind, dedicated companion to the king, others aren't so flattering. To some, she was a scheming Spaniard, intent on sowing discontent in England. Regardless of the truth, the opinion of the person who mattered most to her remains unquestioned. Eleanor had perished in the town of Harby with her dedicated husband by her bedside. In tribute, King Edward erected a stone cross at each stopping point on their journey back to London. These became known as Eleanor Crosses, though only a few have survived to the present day. Her beloved husband's grief was palpable. There are heartbreaking accounts of the grief King Edward suffered following the passing of his wife Eleanor of Castile. The couple's previously mentioned Easter Monday custom was so important to the king that on the first Easter after her demise, he gave Eleanor's ladies the usual sum of money he would have given them per tradition. Among royal history, it is rare to find a couple so devoted to one another, and it may be Eleanor of Castile's greatest legacy. No one was spared from Edward's brutal temper, not even his own children. In one chilling story, his son and heir had the gall to make a demand of him, and the king's reaction was utterly disturbing. Edward flew into a wild rage, physically attacking his son and even tearing large chunks of hair from his head. This was how he treated his own blood, so it should be no surprise that Edward was even more monstrous when it came to his enemies. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page Factinate for more incredible facts about everything.